This is episode 98 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week, we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. And Wally, it's a short week. Happy Memorial Day to everybody. Thanks to all of you out there serving or who have served our country. But despite the short week, we have more entertainment than normal in this podcast due to...
Paul, you've created a media firestorm.
Thank you.
What did you do?
Oh, I dared to tread on the UNM and NMSU football programs. And there are very good reasons for the Rio Grande Foundation, for taxpayers, for students at our institutes of higher learning, for professors and anybody else who wants maybe UNM and NMSU to focus on educating our students for tomorrow, not spending money on semi-pro athletics programs. And we released a paper that kind of went through some of the documents, financials, how these teams continue to lose money, these teams, these departments, how the Board of Regents at the University of New Mexico just kicked the can down the road. All this talk we had about the financials at UNM and the athletic department, and they first crack at it when they were going to pay down $1 million in debt for the program. They just kicked the can down the road.
And just a few short months ago, the big plan was announced. We are going to right the ship financially at University of New Mexico Athletics. A few short months later, like, we didn't really mean that.
So we released a study saying that UNM and NMSU should consider some innovative solutions. One tiny portion of that included throwing out a possibility. We were trying to cushion the blow of just canceling the whole thing. I mean, let's face it, NMSU and UNM football teams have never really been spectacular. The Aggies have been terrible for a very long time. The Lobos have been mediocre to terrible for 15 years now.
And every time they're good, somebody takes their coach and they go to a bigger program, which is those are the few good years.
So we just mentioned offhanded that maybe they should combine the programs. And holy cow, Wally, sometimes it's better to be lucky or even dumb than smart and good, because I didn't think that would be such an explosive topic. But boy, you get the policy into the sports news cycle and fun and hilarity ensues.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Jeff Grammer, who works at the Journal, covers the Lobos sports beat, who I really like, by the way. I think he does a great job of covering it. He took a couple of swipes at you that just made me laugh. One of them is that there was an announcement about the next edition of the New Mexico Bowl. And Jeff's comments was that if the Rio Grande Foundation has their way, one of the teams playing in that game will be our very own UNMSU Lowbags. And so the other comment he had was, I hate it when athletes are told to stick to sports. On the other hand, and then he talks about your proposal. So kudos, Jeff. Thank you for taking a swipe at my podcast co-presenter today. We appreciate the attention. Paul?
Well, Jeff
I don't think it should be low bags, though. I was looking at laggies, but then it sounds like you're kind of dogging it. And so I'm proposing the agobos. So it has go in it, agobos. Maybe that would be what we would go for.
I'm not sure how agobos sounds, but hey, in all seriousness, in first and foremost, I tuned into a sports talk radio station, just happened to be listening, and sure enough, they're talking about me when they were Rio Grande Foundation when I tuned in, and I was able to call in and clear the air a little bit. There are serious issues here at stake. Should taxpayers be helping to finance these programs? Should students be paying fees that are used to benefit programs that they have no interest in? And this isn't just a political question for the legislature, because I have no doubt that given the outcry over canceling some sports at UNM in the legislature, they were not successful in restoring them, but they tried. But given the kind of ramifications this proposal would have, it's unlikely to happen in the near future. However, the Janus versus ASME question of last July about individuals being forced to pay union dues as a precondition of employment, one can make the case that students paying to get an education should not be required to pay the fees for professional semi-pro sports teams at their institutes of higher learning. Taxpayer funded, of course. So it's been fun, and we'll see if this discussion continues. We're going to certainly keep the heat on UNM. Our friend Daniel Libet, who we had a podcast several months ago, he's gotten out of the direct UNM watchdoggy game, but we had some fun with this one, and we're kind of carrying the torch of Daniel Libet and looking at the education and athletic programs at UNM and NMSU.
Well, and I think my assessment is these athletic troubles are just the tip of the iceberg financially and mission wise with higher education in New Mexico. The capacity in terms of number of institutions, number of duplicative programs, the number of branches everywhere, the amount of money that's spent, and the real issue of the value of education, what people have to pay relative to what they get. I think if this seems extreme right now to people, and it does because it's sacred athletics, there are more issues like this coming down from a fiscal point of view, because after all, the reason for a university is education and research. And yes, athletics is there. And, in interest of full disclosure, my dad was a basketball coach at Western New Mexico University. So, growing up, that put food on the Drangmeister table. But, when you look at, say, what a sports program costs in one of these smaller NCAA Division II versus, UNM and New Mexico State, it's a whole different thing. But there are a lot of issues to be addressed. So,
well, I agree with you 100%. There is a lot to look at in New Mexico's higher ed departments and the whole institution of higher learning in the state of New Mexico, and quite frankly in the country, needs to be seriously evaluated. I mean, you look at the charts that you can find anywhere online. Food prices have gone down over the last 20 years. Housing, clothing, all those things, and then you get into what the government does, and even healthcare is left in the dust by higher education and the explosion of costs. And that's been a criticism. We have too many branch campuses. We have too much extraneous spending on various things. And this isn't just the Rio Grande Foundation saying this. Chuki Abdallah, and I'm sure I'm butchering the former UNM president's name, but he sat down with the Journal. This is one of my favorite interviews of June 2017. He said, these are quotes from the former president of UNM. Our higher ed spending is more than most other states. The trouble is we don't spend it wisely, and we spread it across so many entities. We do need a plan. Now, Mr. Abdallah didn't care to keep that job. He was a truth teller and somebody who ultimately left on his own free will to go to other greener pastures in his career path. So he could be honest, and he was very good at his job. He also said, UNM has spires of excellence, best in the world or top 5, but like everything else around this state, that average is bad because you have to make sure everyone is taken care of. And maybe, just maybe, Lobo fans, and I'm speaking to the athletic department and Aggie fans as well, if you got rid of football, just say hypothetically, UNM, rather than merging UNM and NMSU, just said, we're done, we're getting rid of football. Maybe you could be more competitive in basketball, and that fleeting or elusive Sweet 16 that the Lobos have wanted, And I believe the Aggies got there once, but I think
we've gone there a few times, and the Aggies have been to the Final Four. So I might be belaying a little bit of my educational background.
Wally is a proud Aggie grad, but maybe they would be better at the things that they really want to succeed at, which in this state, just by population, the corporate community, the various interests of the people, I can speak as a player of the game of basketball, that this state has the opportunity. These schools have the opportunity to excel in basketball in a way that they are unlikely to ever succeed in football for a variety of reasons. So that's kind of coming at it from the fan perspective. But Wally, this was a fun story. We've had some slings and arrows, but the old adage is there's no such thing as bad publicity, and I think that qualifies with this particular story.
All right, I will close by saying I'm going to exit the podcast with some theme music that I have composed, a little mashup to illustrate your proposal, if you would so allow.
Go ahead. Yes.
All right, very good.
Gladly have that.
All right, next issue. What do we want to talk about?
Well, Wally, we have talked extensively about the closure of the coal-fired power plant in San Juan County, the San Juan Generating Station, the economic struggles and woes of the Four Corners in general, but help is on the way. And, quite honestly, if I had to do, if I was in the media, this kind of story would be really at the very top of the list. There is a story in the Albuquerque Journal. San Juan County signs grant agreement for future film studio. So now we have the San Juan County receiving $1 million. This is a capital outlay project paid for by the state of New Mexico to build a film studio. So not only are we paying 25, 30, or even up to 35 cents on the dollar, which is what San Juan County will be eligible for with the film subsidies, but we are subsidizing the construction of film studios in the state. And it's just terrible, terrible public policy. The film program we've beaten up over the years. The LFC's report that we talked about, I believe, last week explains many, many of the issues. It's not that nobody else in the state gets it besides we at the Rio Grande Foundation. Just nobody else will say anything about it because the level of knowledge and understanding of what is going on here is, I think, woefully lacking. And part of that's just because in New Mexico, it seems like so much money comes from, pennies from heaven when it's really dollars from under the ground.
Yes. Dollars from oil and gas are what allow this kind of proposal to be sustained.
Exactly. That's where that capital outlay money is coming from. It's a very unfortunate, unwise use of those dollars, but that's where we are at this point. And, not a lot can be done. It passed in the last session overwhelmingly, and it is what it is. It's just not a wise use of your tax dollars, folks.
Yeah, and then I was just running some numbers, almost on the back of the envelope, on the back of a scratch pad I have in front of me, and when we look at the dollars, and I know there's capital and operating funds, but what is $500 million to New Mexico? We only have a couple million people here. And so that would be $250 for each person. So when you talk about $500 million, a family of four could get a check literally from the state government, a check for $1,000. Right. So, that's every family in New Mexico could get that check for $1,000 for the kind of money that's being spent.
You're talking, by the way, about the 500, the money being spent above and beyond where we are on the subsidies.
Yeah, exactly.
That was discussed. So, $500 million. It's quite a amount of money, even for state government in the land of enchantment. And speaking of a lot of money, our good friend Randall O'Toole, transportation expert. I know you were at his presentation, Wally, in Albuquerque here the last time he was in town. He is fantastic, and he also did some back of the envelope calculations in a recent blog post, but you can read, again, errorsofenchantment.com for more information. He looked at the 1,200 or so regular commuters. Those are identified by the state, the LFC. That's the number of people who are estimated to ride the Rail Runner to and from Santa Fe every day, most weekdays of the year. And that those people, based on the costs borne by the Rail Runner for the taxpayers for the Rail Runner, for operations, not capital costs, are about $15,000 a year per daily commuter. So just an astonishing amount of tax money from the taxpayers of the state of New Mexico, being poured into this Rail Runner. $15,000 a year per commuter, with not even the capital cost being included. So Randall makes a number of other points. He especially talks about the way land is zoned around Rail Runner stations on the assumption and hope that you will have development. That's happened right there in Santa Fe. There used to be a Flying Star, and there's a movie theater, I think, over there. There's been an effort to use that particular station, but by and large, the Rail Runner stations today are no more developed in terms of coffee shops and whatever around them than they were when they were constructed 12, 13 years ago. But Randall cites that as something that frequently when you get these rezonings to do transit-oriented development, the next thing that comes is taxpayer-subsidized development around a taxpayer-subsidized train. So he noted Portland, of course, and he's very familiar with the Portland streetcar system and the ways that has been done. So Randall, like the Rio Grande Foundation, says it's time to pull the plug, sell it off, and I guess make it the transit equivalent of Lobo and Aggie football.
Well, and not to blend our two stories, but maybe we're going to need the Rail Runner to go down to Spaceport Arena, where we can turn the Spaceport into an arena, kind of in between Albuquerque and Santa Fe, but the fans are going to have a way to get there. And obviously, the world's worst idea is that's not taking lemons and making lemonade. That's taking lemons and swallowing them whole and wondering why your stomach's upset. So...
Well, we'll see what happens at the spaceport. They claim some successes down there. I'm not sure if there's really as much there as they say. It is good. We're going to be paying and are paying for this facility. At least we've got a handful of workers from Branson's company coming into New Mexico, and they'll be doing something to contribute to the state and the economy. But I still want to see butts in the seats for these launches to space. And when that kind of thing starts happening on a regular basis, that's when I'll be willing to at least acknowledge that maybe they have a success on their hands at the spaceport. But we've got a long, long way to go.
Yeah, and to be clear, I'm cheering for the spaceport. I absolutely hope it works. But it's one of those, I get this kind of dull feeling in my stomach when I think about it. And that dull feeling is associated with failures in business and government more often than I'd care to admit. So I really hope it works out well. Yes, it is. There are some encouraging notes, and hopefully that will continue.
No doubt about it. Well, we have government employees, especially top level. What happened to the 99%, Wally? These progressives, leftists, they talk a great game about how they're just going to help the bedraggled working man and the average person. And yeah, I mean, they gave pretty substantial raises, 4% across the board from the state, but 17% to the cabinet officials. What is Michelle Lujan Grisham doing here with these massive raises for cabinet officials? And, does this point to the left not actually believing the hype that they tend to say about overpaid executives and the top people getting richer while everybody else starves to death, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, it seems to be a tad hypocritical at minimum. They talk about that no one should make more than this many times the salary of an average worker. But when you look at state government with these raises, these top officials are earning many times, probably close to 3 times what the average worker is. But they're public servants, so let's keep that
absolutely.
in mind.
Well, of course, the Rio Grande Foundation commented for Channel 7 KOAT when Mayor Keller and his administration gave substantial raises, double digits and upper double digits to the police chief and some other public employees. 17% for all the cabinet officials is very generous with our money again as well. And thank you, oil and gas. We wish sometimes that money wasn't available to blow on things like film subsidies, the rail runner, and massive raises for bureaucrats. But Rio Grande Foundation, not necessarily supportive of giving any government official raises. We cite data in a recent posting from Key Policy Data, which they look at state and local government compensation as a percentage of the private sector. So they're comparing New Mexico private sector employees with state and local government employees in New Mexico. And they found that government compensation in New Mexico was 16% higher than in the private sector. And we had the 16th highest ratio in the country. So we were not necessarily the top paid state bureaucracy relative to the private sector, but we were among the top in terms of overpaying our government workers, 21% above the U.S. average in that pay. So that's 2016 data. I can only imagine that we're going to be even higher up as we see these wages kick in and the raises give these government employees even more money. But ultimately, Wally, whether you think these people need more money or should be paid more money, and you hear we need to attract good people. Well, if we're going to attract good people, we should have some specific metrics in place to determine whether they are doing their jobs. And if it's the police chief, crime, how is crime being impacted? If it's education, how are students performing? How are student test scores going? What's going on with them? For other government officials, it should be maybe something related to economic growth and comparing New Mexico's private sector economic growth to other states. These are the kinds of things that would at least begin to justify some of these raises happening in government. But it just seems to me this is the old maxim, reward your friends, punish your enemies. And in this case, government, our top leaders in New Mexico, Michelle Lujan Grisham, Tim Keller, are rewarding their friends with some very, very generous pay raises.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the governor was, through spokespeople, made some references back to, we're just restoring things back to how they were during the Richardson administration, which was
the good old days.
The good old days when spending ran amok the last time it happened here in our state. So,
absolutely. Well, we have one more story about government spending, and then we've got to talk about the past governor and talk about the big story that happened with her. That wasn't the Rio Grande Foundation, though. But in this next story, U.S. Census Bureau data, annual data comes out on education spending. They look at a lot of different factors. We kind of looked at the top line factor, per pupil spending on K-12 throughout the United States, especially in our case, states that border New Mexico. So that's Colorado, Texas, Arizona, Oklahoma, and Utah. It's not a surprise to anybody who is familiar with the work of the Rio Grande Foundation that U.S. Census Bureau, again, this is their data, New Mexico spends more per pupil than any of our neighboring states. We're close to Colorado. We're at $98.81, so $9,881. And I'm not going to say that I agree with 100% of the way the Census Bureau, the way they analyze their data, but they analyze it consistently across the different states. So it's good data as a comparison mechanism. $9,809, so $9,809 in Colorado. That's the second highest state. Texas, $9,375. And then you get to Arizona, $8,000. Oklahoma, just under $8,000. Utah, $7,100. And by the way, Utah in particular cleans our clocks. Arizona, despite many of the same demographic challenges, also cleans our clocks on performance. So we're spending more money. We already know that that's coming. This is not reflected in the data. What matrix are we going to use to actually consider whether this money that we're spending is improving educational outcomes? It's a good guess because I don't think we have any metrics in place, and we're already spending more than our other states. So we clearly have an adequate spending in our education system already, whether the legislature or the governor thought so or not.
Yeah, and then as you said, what's the performance we're getting for the spending? And just because you're spending a lot of money doesn't mean you're spending it on the right things and that the right programs. And the dreaded park test that the education establishment absolutely despised is gone for now, to be replaced by something else, because without some sort of assessment like that, federal funding for education, they keep a leash on the states by not granting these grants and other funds. If you don't do that, something else is going to have to come to replace that. But in the short term, there's a reprieve, no testing. We're just going to go forward, and hopefully it works out well. I mean, hopefully the next time we get some data, there will be better educational attainment.
And Rio Grande Foundation, we haven't been as engaged on the testing and accountability aspects. We've been much more interested in some choice, keeping charter schools as an option, which was an issue in the last session, and also expanding options in the private sector of school choice, tax credits and other options. But the legislature has had zero interest in expanding educational options. But we believe that ultimately the best judges of an education and its value are the parents, not necessarily government bureaucrats in Santa Fe, no matter how well-intentioned they may be. And I'm including Governor Martinez in that what succeeds in education, or what's considered successful by a test, et cetera, is not always what parents are going to value or potential employers will value down the road. So I think we need to understand that a more organic approach, a more tailor-made approach in education is where we ultimately need to be. But the current administration is systematically going in, and the testing will be there, but the question is how much information will that convey to parents and students and the education bureaucracy itself, because they will likely not be as useful, that information, which is kind of the game plan. That's kind of the point. In having an A through F system, you're trying to give people an understanding of, is this a really good school or a very low performing school, and understanding that. And unfortunately, even that basic accountability is going out the window.
No comment above and beyond. Well said. Thanks, Paul.
Oh, well, thank you, Wally. Yeah, well, more money will be on the way, and we've seen this movie, been to this rodeo before. We're going to have a lot more money poured into education, and my bet is that we're not going to have the results to show for it, but we will be able to know more about that in the years ahead. Finally, Wally, outside of our UNM, NMSU football extravaganza, I think the number one story of this week was Larry Barker's expose. Of course, Larry Barker at Channel 13, KRQE, great, longtime investigative reporter, and he found some intriguing information about $1.7 million in payouts, $1.7 million in payouts that were allegedly made to cover up some embarrassing allegations from the previous administration, Governor Susana Martinez. And as I understand it, there's some information that we just don't know at this point, partially because information is being withheld from the public. And that's a whole different question about open records and transparency and whatnot. But the pieces that we've seen put together basically say that Susana Martinez and her husband were having some marital issues. I had heard personally that they had contemplated divorce. They obviously did not, but there were some issues that were recorded, and people were holding those recordings in above the head of the governor and her staff, and there was payouts made for some of these people who would basically claim, I'm being harassed, so they make a payment through the risk management program at the state. They're kind of the people who green eye shades look at, the opportunities for hurricanes and tornadoes and, terrorist attacks, that kind of stuff. But in this case, they were basically cutting checks to disgruntled workers who were alleging to have information on Governor Martinez and her personal life.
Yeah, and this risk management function, much like in major corporations, if there's a suit brought or a threat, they assess the best way to deal with it. Do we go to court? Do we pay money? And anytime the decision's made to pay money, it's not inconsequential in either the public or the private sector, but in the public sector, there is a higher standard. So it will be interesting to see what comes out of this, what the details are, whether that will ramp up the heat of this story or whether it's an explainable thing to go away. But on first blush, this is not looking like a good, transparent, positive, open government story. So.
Yeah, and it is worth noting, of course, that overall, during Governor Martinez's time in office, she was a staunch fiscal conservative. She tried to keep a lid on government, but that doesn't mean that, even though it's a relatively small amount of money, $1.7 million, it is still the stench of corruption, the stench of personal benefits and payments being made. That is definitely troubling and concerning. And when it comes to politics, quite frankly, Wally, I don't think anybody at this point expected that Governor Martinez was going to run for the U.S. Senate, but there was at least the door available, open, that she might run for some office at some time in New Mexico. She left after a pretty rough couple of years economically and politically. She had quite a bit of a rebound and gave the keys to government and an economy to Michelle Lujan Grisham that was doing pretty well. I don't think this is going to help in any efforts to bring Susana Martinez back into political office in New Mexico. In fact, I suspect this may be the nail in the coffin for her political future to come and do anything in New Mexico. Not that she was going to run for U.S. Senate, but if you looked at the Republican bench, it is extraordinarily short and limited in terms of top-level candidates, and Governor Martinez would have been one of those people. This story is definitely the kind of thing that if you run in any future campaign, you're going to get thrown back in your face very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And in New Mexico, a state that is used to lean Democrat is now clearly in the Democrat. Virtually every major office that can be held statewide and across the state is in Democratic hands. It would be easy to fan any hint of corruption into an issue that could be very damaging for a campaign.
Yeah, and I don't think this rises to the level of some of the things we had in the pay-for-play Richardson administration. Certainly, Martinez, did a better job than I think a lot of people give her credit for with a hostile legislature. That is critical because it's much easier if you have a ideologically simpatico legislature to look like somebody who's succeeding because you can get a lot of things passed. Martinez was constantly fighting on every front, including all of her top cabinet officials, at least Hannah Scandera being a primary example, having to fight to get them approved and just trying to deal with the legislature. It's very hostile. It's a really challenging time in office for her and in many ways for the state, with oil prices being down for a lot of that time, the economy not recovered. When you are a Republican in this state, you have to check a lot of boxes from quite frankly, a racial and demographic perspective. I think that helps. But also you have to be better, more competent, cleaner, and just overall a more dynamic person than the other side. The other side can put up someone who's mediocre and not really a great speaker or photogenic or any of those things, but they have the votes to lead them to victory. And then, heaven forbid, it's R.J. Berry in Albuquerque. And I think, the blue tsunami we saw is, I would say it's generally attributable to R.J. Berry and his legacy in the city of Albuquerque and the ART program that was such a disaster.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation, is that Martinez didn't necessarily have any better or worse time late in her second term than Richardson, but adding to that, you had for the first time in a long time, a Republican mayor of Albuquerque, and if anything, comparatively, things went even worse in Albuquerque than they did for the rest of the state as a whole.
Yeah. Well, folks, exciting week. Check out all those stories about UNM and NMSU and come up with your own nickname and see if you want to submit them over to podcast@riograndefoundation.org. We'd love to hear your thoughts, whether it's about that story or maybe you've got a new fight song in mind that you'd like to compose for the Aggies or Laggies or the Agobos?
The Agobos, that's what I'm putting forth. So,
all right. Well, we'll be, thanks for listening to this week's discussion. We're working every day to turn New Mexico around. Go to riograndefoundation.org for more information or to support our work.
Hail, New Mexico. And then, Aggies, oh Aggies. And both bands playing at the same time, which is what several of the sportscasters have complained about. Thanks a lot, Paul.
Thank you, Wally.